Seattle rain doesn't rush. It falls one drop at a time, steady and patient, like it had signed a long-term contract with the clouds. The smell of coffee from the corner shop blends with damp earth, while the sound of the streetcar hums like the city's morning alarm. I'm Elena Moore, 33, operations assistant at BlueWave Dynamics, currently avoiding my third puddle in under 2 minutes. I've been here 6 years, long enough to know that a positive work culture is often just a polite way to say everyone's exhausted. Our company is famous for its growth rate, and equally famous for having a boss who talks more than he works. I've lost count of how many reports I've written that others later presented as if they'd written themselves. But this morning, I didn't have time to think about that. I was running late. Crossing the parking lot, I saw a man crouched under the rain, trying to fix something that looked like a heavy piece of equipment. His gray uniform was soaked through, his hands covered in grease, his face so tired I could almost hear his sigh blending with the rain. I stopped. Something in the way he moved reminded me of my father, a lifelong factory worker, quiet and enduring. I opened my bag, took out my turkey sandwich and the still warm cup of coffee, the standard breakfast of people who start working earlier than their paycheck allows. Have you eaten yet? I asked. It's cold out here. Don't work on an empty stomach. He looked up, surprised for a second, then just nodded. No, thank you. No small talk. But there was something in his eyes that made me feel unexpectedly calm. I turned away, knowing I'd just lost a few minutes, yet sensing, somehow, that today wouldn't be an ordinary day. As I stepped through the revolving door, Rick Dawson's cologne hit me before I even saw him. Rick, my direct manager, was the kind of man who made sure you remembered him, even when you tried not to. Every morning, he arrived like it was opening night. Tie perfectly off center, hair slicked back until it shone under the lights, smile wide enough to lie convincingly in a shareholder meeting. 10 minutes late, Rick said, voice booming across the floor like an airport announcement. You think the world's going to wait for you? I hung my raincoat on the chair. No, I said quietly, but I think it'll keep spinning without me. He frowned, turned away, leaving behind a cloud of cologne strong enough to make the office plant dizzy. I sat down, powered up my computer. The CPU fan hummed like it was complaining with me. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, keyboards clicked like a collective heartbeat. Steady, hard, tired. I glanced at my calendar. 10 minutes until the welcome meeting for the new CEO. Rick had been talking about it all week with suspicious enthusiasm, as if he were the one getting promoted instead of introducing someone else. I fixed my hair, straightened my blazer, and walked down the hallway. The white LED lights reflected off the floor, bright and cold enough to sting my eyes. When the elevator doors opened, I caught my reflection in the mirror, wet, tired, but still standing. 6 years here, and I'd learned how to keep my cracks invisible. Conference room, 18th floor. 12 people are already seated. Rick stood in the center, report in hand, smile stretched tight. He glanced at me, one of those warning looks that said if I so much as breathed too loudly, he'd dock my pay with his eyes. I sat at the end of the table, the safest place in any meeting, far enough to avoid attention, close enough to hear the sarcasm. We're just waiting for one more person, Rick said, voice firm and rehearsed. I opened my notebook, jotting down, prepare for self-congratulatory speech. The door opened. Footsteps echoed. I looked up, and my heart skipped a beat. A man walked in, dressed in a perfectly pressed black suit, crisp white shirt, hair still damp as if he'd just walked through the same rain. His eyes swept across the room, then stopped exactly where I sat, just for a second. But it was enough. I knew he remembered me. Rick didn't notice. He hurried forward, hand extended, voice pitching higher. Welcome to Blue Wave, Mr. Samuel Cross. We're honored to have you with us. I stayed silent. The water glass in front of me reflected the image of the man I'd shared breakfast with. Now, he was our new CEO. The room buzzed with greetings, polished smiles, and scripted compliments. But all I heard was the rain outside, steady, patient, reminding me that sometimes the quietest gestures spark the biggest changes. I don't know where you're listening to this story, maybe on your lunch break, or on your commute home between honking cars. But if you've ever had your own Rick Dawson, someone who mistook your patience and kindness for weakness, you'll understand this feeling. Don't worry, the best part hasn't even started yet. And if you love stories about smart justice and clean revenge, stay with me. And if you're somewhere it's raining, congratulations. You'll understand me better than anyone else. The air in the conference room felt thick, like coffee forgotten overnight. Laptops glowed, keyboards clicked, and Rick's cologne was strong enough to qualify as a biological weapon. He stood at the head of the table, shoulders tight, smile wide, the kind of smile meant for cameras, not people. I am very pleased to introduce our leadership team to Mr. Cross, Rick said, drawing out his words like he was hosting a show about himself. Every word had a particular ring to it, confident, a little theatrical, with a trace of fear only visible to people who have sat in offices too long. Samuel Cross, the man from the rain this morning, sat at the head of the table, silent. Light from the window slid across the collar of his black suit and lifted onto his calm face. I realized that his silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of someone who was watching everything. Rick went on about growth strategy, trend lines, the sustainability of our innovation ecosystem, phrases shiny enough to make people forget to ask what he actually meant. When he reached the part on internal improvements, he jerked his chin in my direction. Elena handles the small technical details, he said. She's very meticulous, though a little slow. I raised my head and gave a polite smile. No one replied, but I caught Samuel glancing at me before he returned to the folder in front of him. He didn't interrupt Rick. None of us did. We had all learned that reacting at the wrong moment only turns you into the subject of a lessons learned email the next day. Rick rapped with a self-satisfied laugh. I believe that under my leadership, my operations group is a model of efficiency and team spirit. Anyone who had ever heard us work would know that line was as funny as a motivational poster taped up in a bathroom. Samuel set his pen down and nodded once. Thank you, Rick. An impressive presentation. His voice was low and even, no rise, no drop. But every word hit the table like a small stone. He flipped a few pages, then asked, slow and clear, "Could you send me the raw data behind these numbers? I'd like to look a bit closer." Rick stalled for a beat. "Of course," he said quickly. "I'll have Elena prepare it." She knows every detail. I gave a small nod, though he didn't bother to look. I was used to the assign it out, take the credit routine, but this time felt different. Samuel looked directly at me, brief but definite. "Good," he said. "I look forward to seeing it soon." The meeting broke up. People poured into the hallway, tossing out hollow compliments everyone knew weren't real. Rick strode past, tapping his folder like he'd just won something. "See," he said as he passed me, "presence matters, not details." I smiled and let it go. Presence, I thought. The only thing he has that no one wants to learn. By afternoon, the first message from the executive office hit the internal inbox, a request to recheck all financial, operations, and contract data from the past 6 months. I stared at the line, felt my breath lengthen by one count. Not fear, more like the familiar air before a storm, the kind that doesn't roar in, but still sweeps away anything that can't stand on its own. Rick showed up in my doorway wearing a tight smile. "Elena, I need you to help with a few checks for Mr. Cross. Be thorough this time. Let's not have any mistakes." I looked at him and nodded, voice soft, almost nothing. "I'm always thorough, Rick. The question is whether you want the real results." He didn't answer. He left behind cologne and the hard smack of shoes on tile like he was stepping on something tender. I opened my laptop and started pulling folders. In the screen's reflection, I saw myself beginning a chapter I hadn't planned. I used to think workplace storms always started with something dramatic, a heated meeting, a misfired CC, or a public accusation in front of too many witnesses. But in reality, they usually begin quietly, like a broken air conditioner no one bothers to fix, until the whole office starts getting colder than it should. After that morning meeting, BlueWave began to change. No one said it out loud, but the air was different, like the system had just switched from normal to monitoring mode. The first email came from internal audit, requesting a review of all project expenses for Q2 and Q3. Please submit all related raw data by Friday. I got a copy. So did Rick. But I knew he'd never read past the second line. Rick wasn't the kind of man who read emails. He was the kind who sent them, so someone else could fix the mistakes. That afternoon, he walked into my office, tie crooked, cologne sharper than usual, as if he were trying to cover another smell, the smell of fear. Elena, I need you to filter the vendor list for the last 3 projects, NovaFlow, PulseX, and Eon Edge, as soon as possible. I didn't need to open the system to know. Those 3 projects existed only on PowerPoint, nothing but names. What filters do you want me to use? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Rick's eyes flicked to the right, a reflex of a man about to lie. Just check the payment dates and approvers, that's all. I nodded. In my head, I'd already opened a folder named Temp Backup. Do not delete. That night, I stayed late. The printer downstairs hummed in rhythm with the rain hitting the windows, like percussion for an old, familiar song. I brought up the 6-month expense report. Line by line, the numbers appeared, cold and metallic. A strategic consulting firm received over $120,000 with no attached contract. A series of team development programs signed by Rick, but no actual projects to match. An R&D optimization group, a name that sounded like something an AI made up out of boredom, had been wired 7 payments, all approved on the same day. I sat there, fingers tight on the mouse until the plastic creaked. But no, I wasn't shocked. Just cold. Not because Rick was corrupt, I'd suspected that long ago, but because I was the one who entered those numbers, who formatted them neatly, aligned every column, adjusted every comma. I had helped make the lies look clean. I stood up, poured a glass of water. The cold hit my throat sharper than any compliment Rick had ever thrown my way in a meeting. I sat back down and began backing up everything: files, drafts, emails, all the things I knew would vanish the moment Rick smelled trouble. 6 years working with him hadn't taught me how to be recognized, but it taught me how to survive without taking the blame. The next morning, Rick arrived with his signature smile, the same one he used to convince investors that a demo that barely loaded could revolutionize the market. Elena, he said, I know yesterday's requests were a little sudden, but it's fine. We're a team, right? You and me, we understand each other. I nodded, keeping my smile at the precise level between harmless and unavailable. Rick winked, patted my shoulder, and walked out. Before the door even closed, I plugged in the external drive and kept backing up. That night, I left late. The office lights dimmed one by one until only I and the past were left. In a storage box, I found the notes I used to write to myself, lines typed in the quiet of someone who once believed, just endure a little longer and things will settle. One note stood out, dated last March. Today, he said, I turned things around. But only I know that the chart was fixed at 2 in the morning. I used to write those lines to comfort myself. Now, they were evidence. I looked at the screen, the folders, the backups, and then at my reflection in the window. I wasn't the quiet assistant waiting to be recognized anymore. I was the one who understood the system, where it cracked, who was hiding behind the gloss. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted the truth to exist in the same room that had echoed only with the manipulator's voice. I shut down the computer and looked out the window. Seattle was still raining. In the glass, my face looked tired but awake, and in my mind, a quiet line formed. Tomorrow, nothing will be the same. The next morning, I woke to the sound of light rain and a weight in my chest, the kind that comes when your heart hasn't caught up with what your mind uncovered the night before. The numbers were still there in my head: codes, contracts, approvals, all the traces of Rick hiding in the dark. When I walked into the BlueWave building, my coworkers' glances carried something cautious, like they were trying to see if I'd changed overnight. I kept my steps steady, pretending everything was normal. But I knew it wasn't. Before I even reached my desk, Rick passed by. His tie was crooked, his eyes cold. He glanced at my screen, just for a second, but long enough to tell me he was watching. What he didn't know was that sometimes the watcher sees the trap before the watcher does. The air in the company had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Rumors began to drift. Elena caught the new CEO's attention. She and Samuel talked privately yesterday. The whispers moved through the office like a draft under a closed door, quiet, but enough to shake something inside you. A few hours later, I got an internal email with an innocent subject line: Morning Coffee and CEO Dialogue. Beneath it, a small note read, "Those who attend will understand what's changing." I didn't open the link. I had no interest in feeding the rumor mill. By noon, HR called me into a small meeting room. I brought the data summary I planned to submit the next day, but the air inside felt heavier than usual. The soft yellow light made every flaw look sharper. "Miss Elena," the HR manager said, her face uneasy, "we've received concerns about a close relationship between you and the new CEO. We'd like to give you the chance to clarify before the rumors spread further." I took a slow breath. I'm not sure what close means to others. I just do my job. Before she could answer, the door opened quietly. Samuel walked in without a word. His presence was calm, grounding, like a kind friend stepping into a storm. "I invited her because of her competence, not because of gossip," he said, his voice even, but firm enough to steady the air. The HR manager blinked, stammered an apology, and excused herself. After she left, Samuel and I stayed by the window. The rain had softened, as if the sky itself wanted to ease the pressure. "I'm sorry if I made you feel isolated," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "I'm used to it." He smiled faintly, like he could hear the truth in my tone. "I've stood where you stand, overlooked, blamed for things I couldn't control. I learned to watch before I speak." He told me how years ago, while leading a major project, he'd watched his team work through endless nights under upper management that had no idea what was actually happening. When mistakes came, he took the fall, lost authority, lost trust, became the ghost of conversations in rooms he was no longer invited to. I know what it feels like to be buried under someone else's success, he said, his eyes softer now. That's why I watch every broken piece before I rebuild the whole picture. For the first time, I saw him not as the new CEO, but as someone who'd been wounded too, and understood the loneliness that comes with survival. A quiet trust began to form, fragile but real. It didn't take long for Rick to sense the shift. That afternoon, I passed him near the conference room. He stood whispering with a few of his loyal staff. They lowered their heads, silent. Through the glass, I saw him glance sharply toward my office when one of them said my name. That evening, an anonymous email appeared in my inbox. "I had a private meeting with Samuel yesterday, proof of our relationship." No signature, no source, just hurried lies. I read it line by line, my chest still but cold. I didn't delete it. I didn't reply. I knew how to let data speak louder than noise. When dusk came, the office was nearly empty. I stayed behind, opened my screen, and pulled up the backups. File names, timestamps, revision logs, each small detail fitting together like bricks forming a wall of truth. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Samuel. "Elena, prepare the 6-month summary. Don't worry. The light will reveal whoever hides in the dark." I stared at the screen, the glow reflecting in my eyes. My smile wasn't one of certainty, but of resolve. I had chosen to stand, not to climb over anyone, but to let truth have a voice in a place that had long echoed with deceit. I shut down the computer and stepped into the dim hallway. My shadow stretched beside me, long and steady, like evidence that couldn't be erased. Inside, I knew the mind games had only just begun, and I would hold my ground. No retreat, no surrender, until those who feared the light had nowhere left to hide. I sat in front of the large screen, the blue light reflecting off my glasses like a mask of pure focus. One by one, I opened each backup file, every detailed report from the past 6 months. The only sounds in the room were the slow spin of the fan and the steady rain outside, two cold, rhythmic accompaniments to the silent investigation. I used to be the person behind the flawless reports, the quiet one fixing errors, double checking numbers, adjusting each line of data to keep everything running smoothly, even when the truth underneath was far from clean. But today, I wasn't here to tidy up anyone's lies. Today, I was here to find the light. I combed through every transaction, every vendor record. Slowly, one name kept rising to the surface: Optimus Consulting Solutions, a company with almost no contract details in our system, only a vague entry under outsourced services. When I opened their banking record, the transfers told a story of their own. More than $300,000, paid in 3 installments, labeled as technical support and operations consulting. What sent a chill down my spine was the name on every approval line, the same employee code, the same signature: Rick Dawson. Each line repeating like a carbon copy of a familiar lie. I only signed. I printed everything: spreadsheets, bank statements, change logs, internal email threads, and laid them neatly across the small conference table that Samuel often used when he wanted quiet. The overhead light hit the papers directly, like it were cross examining every word. Samuel entered, glanced at the stack, and stood in silence for a moment before saying, "Good. Let him lie first." That was all he said, and it was enough. The room went still. I looked up at him. His eyes held no shock, no rush, just patience. When the leadership meeting began, Rick took the floor like a headliner stepping into the spotlight. He spoke about technological expansion, cost optimization, capital efficiency, and team strength. His words flowed with confidence, polished like a pre recorded script. When he finished, Samuel spoke quietly. "Thank you, Rick, but I'd like to see the actual data." Ivan, the head of finance, pressed a key, and the big screen came alive with spreadsheets. Rows moved, figures appeared, graphs unfolded. I sat still, hand resting on my notebook, eyes fixed on the screen. Then came the data I'd printed that morning: the fake company, the bank transfers, Rick's signature on every approval line. Inside me, something broke open. A shiver crawled down my neck. Rick froze. Beads of sweat gathered at his temples. That, that's a system glitch, he stammered. Accounting software error. His voice cracked mid-sentence, like a man gripping a rope he didn't realize had already snapped. Samuel smiled, not mockingly, but with a cold calm, the kind a surgeon wears when looking at an incision already made. "Accounting systems don't sign expense authorizations, Rick," he said, "and they don't invent digital signatures." The room filled with the sound of exhaling. No words, just the shared weight of realization. Eyes darted between Rick, the screen, and each other. Rick tried to speak, but the words never came. I stayed silent. Sitting still, I felt like someone watching a film she already knew the ending to, except she was in it. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the scrape of chairs shifting, the whisper of printed pages still lying under the light. Samuel turned a page on the podium, scanning the room. Then he gave me a subtle nod to stay quiet. He had a larger plan in motion. I lowered my gaze, understanding. This wasn't the battle. It was only the opening act. The air at BlueWave had grown thick, like the ceiling had lowered a few inches, pressing down on every breath. Each exchanged glance carried a layer of caution. Even the sound of a coffee cup hitting the table seemed louder than usual, like it was touching the web of tension stretched tight between the glass walls. I walked down the hallway, my thin jacket doing nothing against the cold creeping from the inside out. The wind didn't pass through the doors, but the silence, the fragmented whispers along my path, chilled my skin just the same. I knew then there was no room left for weakness. When I powered on my computer, the screen lit up oddly. The files I'd spent the entire week arranging were gone. The Q2 audit folder was empty. The hidden backups had vanished too. Only a few hollow folders remained, like the shells of data that once lived. I knew instantly. Rick was erasing the trail. I could picture it. The night before, him sitting in the dark, shirt sticking to his back, hands trembling as he typed the delete commands. Maybe he thought that erasing files meant erasing guilt. But he didn't know I had already backed up everything 24 hours earlier. One copy on an external drive, one on my personal computer at home, and one encrypted upload hidden under a random cloud folder titled Apple Pie Recipe 2003. 6 years working under Rick had taught me one thing. When he faced a crisis, he denied it. And I'd been preparing for this moment of denial ever since the day he taught me how to temporarily handle a financial discrepancy. At around 9 a.m., Rick walked into my office. No knock, no greeting. He closed the door behind him and slid the lock. The metallic click landed like a challenge. His tie was wrinkled, his eyes swollen, his face sleepless, but his voice tried to sound calm. Elena, you can help me this time. I looked up. Help? He lowered his tone. Yes, I know you have the data. If you stand with me, I'll protect you. When this blows up, it won't just be me they drag down. They'll take you with me. You've seen how this company treats people once they're no longer useful. Do you really think Samuel Cross will protect you forever? Silence hung between us for a few seconds before his voice turned urgent. Elena, we've worked together for 6 years. You're not like them. I need you. If you stand with me, I swear I'll pull you up. I have connections. I can make this right. I straightened my back, fingers laced together. You're right, Rick. I'm not like them. I've been dismissed, overlooked, and ignored. But you're wrong about one thing. I don't need anyone to pull me up anymore. He froze, then muttered, You're making a mistake, Elena. I've saved you from plenty before. You owe me. I answered quietly, I've paid you back, with years of silence. He stared at me for a long second, then turned and slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room like the exclamation mark of an unspoken war. That afternoon, an internal email from Samuel arrived. All hands meeting, 9:00 a.m. tomorrow. Attendance mandatory. I read it, my stomach tightening with a mix of dread and resolve. Rick must have received it too. I could already hear his voice down the hallway, whispering to someone about false rumors and misunderstandings. He was building a fortress of words, hoping it would shield him from the light. That night, the office was silent. I stayed behind, surrounded by hundreds of lines of data, names, dates, amounts, approval codes, digital signatures. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to come. I wondered if I was about to destroy someone's career. Rick was guilty, yes, but part of me was guilty too, for staying silent long enough to let him dig his own grave. Then the memory came back. 2 years ago, Rick humiliating a junior employee in the middle of a meeting. Everyone laughed along, except me. She left a week later. I could still see her eyes, still hear his smirk, and I realized my fear was smaller than the fear of watching that happen again. I shut down the screen, slipped the hard drive into my bag, and locked the drawer. The final backup I sent to Samuel through a secure channel, one only he and I could access. I typed slowly. The report is ready. Do what you believe is right. Click, send. No explosions, no soundtrack, just the soft whistle of wind through the window frame. But I knew that moment had shifted the air across the entire building. I gathered my things, turned off the lights, and paused by the glass door. Seattle was still wet, but a faint glow from the building across the street spilled through, like the first glimmer of truth breaking through the fog. And deep down, I knew, from here on, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about who would let the truth be seen. The next act would begin at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Before dawn broke through the windows on the 18th floor, I was already there. The lights in the corridor were dim, the silence heavier than usual, as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I carried the external drive, printed reports, and a quiet confidence. Behind me, footsteps echoed one by one, doors opening and closing softly. People arriving to witness whatever was about to unfold. Rick showed up first. From a distance, he looked composed, but up close, the details betrayed him. Slightly swollen eyes, hands tightening around his briefcase a little too often. The internal bulletin had invited the entire company to a financial transparency and strategy update. When everyone had gathered, the stage was set like a ceremony. Spotlights fixed on the podium, the big screen glowing with a title slide: Financial Overview, Truth and Transparency. Rick stood there with his practiced smile, speaking before anyone else could. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to share with you. He talked about performance, growth metrics, and unrecognized efforts. His voice flowed, but I watched the small betrayals. His lips trembling as he reached the last slide, his finger hesitating over the clicker. Then Samuel stepped onto the stage, not like a man commanding authority, but like a storyteller reclaiming the narrative. He nodded once, pressed the remote, and the screen flickered. Then appeared Optimus Consulting Solutions. 3 large payments: $120,000, $100,000, $80,000. Approved by the executive code belonging to Rick Dawson, accompanied by meaningless notes like operations support and process optimization, and then a snippet of an internal email. I noticed irregularities in these entries. Please confirm with Rick. From a finance associate named Sophie. The room went completely still. Data can't fake emotion. Numbers can't hide the truth. Rick stood before the glowing screen, sweat sliding slowly down his collar. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Samuel didn't rush to accuse. He simply looked around the room and said evenly, Robert Dawson, holding executive authority in this company, approved payments to a vendor with no valid contract. Would you like to explain that? Silence thickened. Rick tried to steady his breathing, as though he could inhale enough to anchor himself. That's... It's not a system error, Samuel said, his tone calm but sharp. It was a choice. Systems don't decide who signs. The finance team stirred. Uneasy glances, chairs shifting, a few people pulling out their phones, maybe to record, maybe to remember. Rick's eyes darted around the room, searching for the exit that no longer existed. I stayed still. My eyes were fixed on the screen. My shoulders trembled slightly, but not from fear, from the nearness of justice. I didn't speak because I didn't need to. The truth was speaking. For me. Rick managed. I was just following procedure. Samuel tilted his head slightly, almost smiling. Which procedure is that? The one that allows signing payments to companies with no contracts and no deliverables? He turned to the secondary display. And here, he said, switching screens, the IT access logs show Rick logging into the system at 11:42 p.m., outside normal authorization hours. The record confirms that data was altered before submission for approval. A low gasp rippled across the room. Someone covered their mouth. Another opened their notes app. Rick's mouth hung open, but no sound followed. Sweat rolled down his temple and disappeared into his collar. He stepped back once. I thought, if he cried now, I wouldn't be surprised. But what I saw wasn't fear, it was exhaustion. The kind that comes from knowing the fight is already lost. Samuel turned toward me and said softly, Elena did this work. She didn't do it to bring anyone down. She did it to let the truth stand up. A small wave of applause broke out. Not loud, but sincere. A few people stood, clapping hesitantly. People who once whispered that I was the CEO's favorite. Now they applauded the woman they had never really seen. Rick turned. His eyes met mine. Defeat, anger, and something else. Realization. He looked at me, then at Samuel, as if to ask, how did she end up with the power I never had? Samuel stepped forward, his tone steady. We are suspending Robert Dawson effective immediately pending internal and legal investigation. You will remain in the building until verification is complete. Chairs scraped. Footsteps shuffled louder than usual as people rose. 2 security officers approached. Rick wasn't handcuffed, but the look in his eyes said everything. His power had already been taken. Before leaving, his gaze stopped on me one last time. For a brief second, I saw no hatred there, only recognition. The look of a man finally seeing the person he'd underestimated. I didn't smile, I simply nodded. When the door closed behind him and the light from the projector glowed over the frozen spreadsheets, Samuel turned back to the room. We don't punish mistakes, he said quietly. We punish deception. And today, BlueWave has proven it no longer fears the truth. A few colleagues came over, their hands brushing my shoulder. You really did it? One whispered. Thank you for not staying silent. I pressed my lips together, alert and calm, because I knew this wasn't the end. But at least today, the light had finally reached a darkness that everyone once swore didn't exist. The conference room door closed behind Rick, the click of the lock sounding like a marker in time. A chapter of power had just ended. He, the man who once stood under the brightest lights, was stepping off the stage, and I, the person no one ever noticed, found myself standing in the place where every gaze in the room had quietly turned. Samuel spoke softly, his voice not loud, but steady enough to echo through the silence. We don't punish mistakes, we punish deceit. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration. The data on the screen had already made it clear. This wasn't a single breach, but an entire network built in the dark. Moments later, the internal announcement went out. Robert Dawson suspended from his role as division director. Interim management to be jointly led by Samuel Cross and Elena Moore. The news spread like fire through dry grass, from finance to engineering to marketing. Everyone knew the balance of power inside BlueWave had just shifted. In the following hours, as I walked through each department, I could feel the air changing. Whispers followed me. She actually did it. Didn't think I'd live to see this day. Some nodded as I passed. Others stopped mid-step, watching from behind glass walls. Their looks weren't resentful anymore. They carried curiosity, respect, and a fragile kind of hope. I entered Rick's old office, not to claim it, but to look at the space where power had lived. I flipped on the light. Darkness withdrew as the white glow spread across the room. Drawer by drawer, file by file, light pushed away the shadows, as if truth itself was finally allowed to exist. Then came the internal system, Rick's old domain of control. With my new credentials, I calmly removed his name from the leadership network. No public announcement, no ceremony, just a single command: remove user from leadership roles. One press of enter. My name, Elena Moore, head of strategic operations, interim, appeared in the updated chart. I looked at the screen, then at the conference room outside. Everyone was quiet, eyes on the display, waiting for what came next. Samuel entered behind me and placed a steady hand on my shoulder. My heartbeat was calm now. No tremor, just focus. He whispered, "You all right?" I answered softly, "I'm ready." The words weren't loud, but they carried enough weight to break through the quiet. I had finally stepped beyond silence. Soon after, I joined the finance department heads for an internal meeting. I stood in the center, reviewing each report, every proposal to fix broken processes and eliminate vague contracts. Voices overlapped, some firm, some uncertain. "We need people we can trust," someone said. I met their eyes, not with new authority, but with responsibility. Fairness, I told myself, had to be practiced, not preached. In the hallway, Sophie, the analyst who had first sent the warning email, approached me. Her eyes glimmered. "Thank him." "You," she said quietly. I smiled. "Let's keep going." Another colleague hesitated before asking, "Do you really think we can change the culture here?" I met his gaze. "If not today, then when?" By day's end, I found myself at Rick's old desk. Empty now. Quiet. I sat down and opened my laptop. The internal systems had already been updated. New approval rights, stricter audit checks, and a transparent oversight module. Small steps, but they mattered. I placed my hand on the glass surface of the desk, looking at my reflection. The Elena staring back wasn't silent anymore. She wasn't just a witness. Outside, Seattle's rain still fell, soft and steady. But inside this building, it sounded different. The rhythm had changed. The rain was no longer background noise. It was the sound of renewal. I opened an email from Samuel. "Tomorrow's meeting will include the new organizational announcement and strategic direction. Rest if you can." I looked out the window. Raindrops slid down the glass. The conference lights reflected on their surface. My name glowed in the new org chart. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and exhaled with purpose. I stood, slipped off my damp coat, and placed the external drive in the drawer. It was still heavy, with data, with truth, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. Not because the victory was complete, but because today I was no longer the forgotten shadow. I walked down the long hallway, light spilling across the walls, my shadow stretching behind me with every step. I knew challenges were waiting ahead, but this time I owned the direction of my next move, not for power, but for responsibility and for the truth. Seattle was still drizzling that morning, but I no longer felt the cold. I arrived early, walking down the hallway that once echoed with the footsteps of power, now a path of my own. Rick's desk sat empty, everything he once touched now just a quiet memory. In my inbox, an internal invitation, a midday gathering across departments titled The Transparent Beginning. The note said everyone should bring their own lunch, a small gesture to rebuild trust. I didn't know who sent it. Maybe something Rick had planned before his suspension, or maybe Samuel's way of resetting the rhythm. But I knew I would go. I packed my lunch the same way I used to on all those early mornings. But this time there was no anxious knot in my chest, no guarded thoughts, just a quiet sense of beginning again. At noon, everyone gathered in the lobby. A long white tablecloth stretched across the tables, sunlight filtering through the tall glass walls, elegant yet warm. Every eye turned toward the small stage where Rick once stood, but today it was empty, waiting for a new voice. Samuel stepped up, holding a small mic. His tone was calm, even. Today, he said, we're not just sharing lunch, we're sharing time. To listen. Then he looked at me and nodded, a silent invitation. I stood, walked to the center table, and placed my lunch at the spot once reserved for the old leader. The room quieted. My voice was low but steady. I just want to remind us that transparency and kindness aren't privileges, they're how we make sure everyone is seen and respected. Applause began softly, then spread across the room. It wasn't loud or performative, just enough to remind each person they weren't alone anymore. As lunch went on, I heard the murmurs around me. You did what so many were afraid to start. I'd like to work for someone like you. From now on, we should all be accountable. The voices were small, but they carried weight. The afternoon passed in a warmth I hadn't felt at Blue Wave in years. No more guarded looks, no rumors, just people connecting, sharing food, and speaking truths that once would have been whispered behind closed doors. Later, I walked into Rick's old office again, the house of power, now quiet. I turned on the light, letting every corner shine. I opened the internal systems and began resetting permissions, line by line, each small change another seal against future shadows. Samuel entered behind me, resting a hand on my shoulder. Are you okay? He asked. I met his eyes, took a deep breath. I'm ready. Before leaving for the day, I drafted one last internal message. Today was our first transparent lunch, but this story about fairness, integrity, and kindness is only beginning. I stepped out of the building. Raindrops streaked the glass, hallway lights casting my shadow long behind me. My steps were lighter than they'd been in months, but each one carried something solid, a certainty that Blue Wave was no longer a place where silence buried the truth, but where people could finally look each other in the eye with respect. And in the steady rhythm of the rain, I heard the city exhale, as if Seattle itself was breathing again after a long storm. You know, some victories don't come with medals or applause. They come when you can look at yourself and say, I didn't give up. If you've stayed with me until the end, tell me, what moment in this story made you stop? Made you feel like someone just told your story? I'll read every comment, the way I once read every detail, searching for the truth. And if you believe that justice doesn't need noise, only timing, hit follow and turn on notifications. More stories are waiting to be told. Thank you for staying until the very end.